The cameras were already rolling when JD Vance leaned forward, his microphone catching every calculated syllable. It was supposed to be another bland Senate oversight hearing, this time on federal funding for women's health clinics. But the moment Jasmine Crockett walked in, wearing that steel gray suit and the look of someone who didn't come to play, you could feel the tension crackle. Vance had been waiting for this moment. He didn't even bother to hide it. He stacked his papers into a neat pile and cleared his throat with the practiced gravitas of a man who'd rehearsed every line. "Representative Crockett," he began, stretching out her title like it was something he found amusing, "you've been quite vocal in defending so-called reproductive rights." A murmur moved across the chamber. So-called. The phrase hung in the air like cheap cologne. Jasmine didn't react. She simply folded her hands and met his stare head-on, her expression unblinking, the corners of her mouth set. Vance went on. "If you truly cared about women's health, maybe you'd focus on the thousands of unborn lives destroyed every year in your district rather than demanding more taxpayer dollars for what you call access." He almost smiled. He thought he'd landed the first punch. And maybe, in some other room, with some other woman, he would have. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "Senator," she said evenly, her voice carrying through every microphone, "if you're going to lecture me about caring for women, you might want to start by actually listening to them." Someone in the back shifted. A staffer scribbled a note. Vance leaned back, crossing his arms with that smirk he wore on cable news panels. "I listen to Americans who value life," he shot back. "That's funny," Jasmine said, still calm, "because you didn't seem to listen to the nurses from Jackson County who testified about women hemorrhaging in ERs after being denied care. You didn't listen to the mother who nearly died because the nearest OBGYN closed when your party defunded clinics." Her tone was measured, almost casual. But every word hit the room like a hammer. Vance's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to bring receipts this early. And she wasn't finished. "You want to shame me?" Jasmine said, raising an eyebrow. "You want to question my integrity because I refuse to let women die quietly while you pretend it's about faith? Fine. But if you think I'm going to stand here and let you rewrite reality, you've picked the wrong woman." The whole chamber seemed to hold its breath. Even the stenographer paused, waiting for the next words. And Jasmine was only just getting started. JD Vance shifted in his seat, but Jasmine didn't give him time to recover. She flipped open the binder she'd brought, a thick, dog-eared stack of testimony, hospital reports, and court filings. The pages whispered as she turned them, the sound somehow louder than any of his scripted outrage. "Let's talk about hypocrisy," she said, her voice low and precise, each syllable a scalpel. "You've co-sponsored legislation that bans abortion even in cases of rape or incest. You stood in front of cameras and called it moral clarity." A flicker of annoyance passed across his face. Cameras zoomed in, capturing that moment, a powerful man realizing he'd lost control of the narrative. "But when your own donors' companies were sued for denying maternal leave or firing pregnant employees," Jasmine continued, "you called it an overreach of government. Suddenly, protecting life wasn't your priority anymore." A wave of whispers swept the room. Someone in the gallery coughed, trying to hide their surprise. It wasn't just her words, it was the calm certainty in her delivery. She wasn't reading talking points. She was recounting facts he couldn't erase. Vance tried to laugh it off. "That's a gross mischaracterization. Is it?" Jasmine leaned in, her eyes locked on his. "Because I have the court records right here. And I have the women's statements. And unlike you, Senator, I don't need to twist their stories into convenient slogans." He looked down at the desk. For a split second, he looked like he might interrupt again. But she didn't wait for permission. "When you call reproductive health so-called rights, you're not debating policy," she said. "You're mocking survivors. You're telling them that what happened to their bodies, to their families, is just collateral damage for your campaign ads." Someone in the back row whispered, "Wow," under their breath. Jasmine lifted her chin. And if you think I'm going to be silent while you turn their pain into applause lines. She tapped her binder once, firmly. You don't know me. For the first time in the hearing, JD Vance looked cornered. Not by volume, not by insults, but by a quiet, relentless clarity he couldn't outspin. And the cameras were still rolling. The air in the chamber turned heavy, as if everyone was waiting for JD Vance to find some clever comeback, some line rehearsed in a mirror that could salvage his composure. But all he did was clear his throat and glance at his notes that suddenly seemed flimsy compared to the binder Jasmine Crockett held in her hands like a ledger of truths no one wanted read aloud. You know what bothers me most, Senator? Jasmine's voice softened, but the softness didn't feel like retreat. It felt like the quiet before a lightning strike. It's the way you pretend you're defending life while ignoring every life you're willing to sacrifice to look righteous. A few reporters leaned forward, pens poised. I met a woman in Dayton last year. Her name is Lillian. She was already a mother of 3 when she got pregnant again. Complications nearly killed her. But because of the law you championed, her doctors had to call attorneys before they could treat her bleeding. Jasmine looked up, letting the silence underline every syllable. She almost died waiting for permission. JD Vance shifted again, trying to look unbothered. It wasn't working. Do you know what she told me? Jasmine continued, her gaze locked on his. She said she never thought she'd live in a country where the courts had more say over her uterus than her doctor. Jasmine set the binder down on the table, the thump echoing across the microphone. And you call that freedom? A ripple of discomfort moved through the chamber. Even some of Vance's allies looked uneasy. This wasn't a soundbite war anymore. It was a moral audit, and he was failing it in real time. Vance tried again, voice low. It's not as simple as you're making it. But that's the point, Jasmine said, cutting him off with the first real spark of anger in her tone. It's never simple for the women you're willing to endanger. You want to stand behind that seal, she gestured toward the massive congressional emblem on the wall, and pretend you have the moral high ground. But you don't. She took a breath, steadying her voice. You don't, because you are willing to ignore every consequence, every statistic, every life story that doesn't fit your narrative. You call it clarity. I call it cowardice. And for a moment, there was nothing. No retort. No applause. Just the cold truth hanging in the air, undeniable. And Jasmine hadn't even used half of what she'd brought with her. The chairwoman glanced between them, her gavel hovering in the air as if she might step in. But even she knew there was no stopping it now. The room had become something more than a hearing. It was a reckoning. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She let her next words come slow, deliberate, so no one could pretend they hadn't heard. You stand here talking about protecting the innocent. But where was your outrage when thousands of babies were born in counties with no prenatal care because clinics were defunded? Where was your compassion when those same children went hungry because their mothers were forced out of work? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The facts did all the shouting for her. Where was your moral clarity, she pressed, when your donors were lobbying to cut Medicaid benefits for the poorest women in Ohio? A hush rolled across the gallery. JD Vance's face had gone still. And Jasmine leaned in just enough for the cameras to catch the fire in her eyes. You have the audacity to question my commitment to life while you vote against programs that keep those children fed, housed, and educated, she said. That's not pro-life. That's pro-political theater. She gestured toward the reporters lining the back wall. You think if you say abortion enough times, no one will notice how many other ways you fail these families, she continued. But I'm not here to let you hide behind that word. JD's mouth opened, maybe to protest, maybe to pivot, but Jasmine didn't give him the space. Let's be clear, she said. You don't get to shame women for making impossible choices in impossible situations when you've never once lifted a finger to make their lives easier. A single camera flash went off. The light caught JD's expression, somewhere between irritation and realization. He was losing this, and he knew it. Jasmine rested her hand on the binder again, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow felt louder than any speech she'd given. "You want to debate policy?" she said. "Fine. But don't pretend you're the voice of morality when you've made a career out of punishing the vulnerable." A chill settled over the room. And in that hush, everyone could feel the weight of it, the hypocrisy, the theater, and the one woman who refused to play along. JD Vance swallowed, his gaze flicking down to the stack of notes he'd prepared, statements he'd expected to deliver without interruption, without consequence. But Jasmine Crockett was turning each line of his script into evidence against him. She straightened her papers, not because she needed them but because the motion gave her one extra moment to look around the chamber. Her eyes landed on the interns in the back row, the women clutching notepads with nervous hands. She knew some of them were here because they believed politics could still matter. She was going to prove them right. "Senator," she said, her voice calm again, "you can spin statistics all day. You can cherry-pick moral arguments that sound noble in a soundbite. But here's the truth." She lifted one page high enough for the cameras to see, an affidavit from a rural Ohio hospital, signed by 3 doctors who had been forced to consult lawyers before treating an ectopic pregnancy. "This is what your policies look like in real life," she said. "Not theory. Not faith. Not a headline. A woman bleeding on a gurney while a hospital lawyer tries to decide if saving her life is worth the lawsuit." JD Vance exhaled, slow and controlled, but it couldn't hide the tension in his jaw. "Is that your idea of moral leadership?" Jasmine asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like neglect." He opened his mouth, maybe to deflect, maybe to accuse her of playing politics. But she wasn't finished. "You think you can shame me because I won't pretend that suffering is virtuous," Jasmine said, her voice rising just enough to fill the room without shouting. "But you don't get to do that, Senator. Not when you've sat in this building for years voting against paid leave, child care support, and funding for health clinics." Her hand dropped to her side. She let the silence stretch. "You've decided the only thing that matters is controlling what happens to women's bodies," she continued, "while you ignore every other way their lives are endangered." Another ripple of murmurs. Someone near the press table wiped their eyes. Jasmine glanced at the chairwoman and then back at JD Vance. "You want to have this conversation in front of the American people?" "Good," she said. "Because they deserve to see the truth behind your talking points." And for the first time all morning, Vance didn't look like he wanted the cameras to stay on. The chairwoman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She knew the cameras were still live, beaming this moment into living rooms and phone screens across the country. But even she wasn't going to interrupt now. The stakes were too obvious. Jasmine took one more step forward, just enough to close the distance across the polished wood of the witness table. Her voice was quieter, but every word seemed to ring louder. "You know, Senator," she began, "I've heard you talk about personal responsibility. You love that phrase, responsibility. You use it every time you want to shame a woman for a choice she never asked to make." Her gaze locked on him. No blinking. No softening. "But when the responsibility is yours, when it's your votes, your signature, your party's agenda, suddenly it's nobody's fault," she said. "Suddenly, it's the courts. Or the system. Or the media. Anything to keep your conscience clear." Vance shifted again. His expression was still composed, but his shoulders had tensed in a way the cameras didn't miss. Jasmine didn't let up. "Do you know what real responsibility looks like?" she asked. "It's a woman driving 4 hours to get to the only clinic left open in her state. It's a doctor risking prison to save a patient's life. It's a mother trying to keep her children fed after your policies stripped her health coverage." She set the page in front of her down on the table with a quiet, final snap. "And you call that politics? I call it survival." Her voice stayed level, but the force of it made the entire chamber feel smaller, tighter, like the air had thickened. "For years," she said, you've stood behind your podiums and talked about family values. But you've never once valued the families who don't fit your narrative. A low murmur spread across the back row. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting. Jasmine looked down at the binder, thick with evidence and testimonies, and then lifted her gaze back to him. And let's be clear, she finished, you can dismiss me, you can dismiss every woman who's ever had to fight for her own medical care. But you can't dismiss the truth. You can't legislate it away, and you can't bully it into silence. The hearing room was silent except for the hum of the cameras. In that hush, Jasmine Crockett looked less like a witness and more like a verdict. And JD Vance seemed to realize it. Jasmine let the quiet linger. She wanted everyone watching, every voter, every lawmaker, every woman sitting at home with her jaw clenched, to feel it. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was an unmasking. JD Vance shifted again, glancing over at the chairwoman as if to ask, "Are you really going to let her keep going?" But the chairwoman didn't lift her gavel. She just folded her hands and waited. Jasmine's tone dropped almost to a whisper, but it had that rare, dangerous clarity, the kind that doesn't need volume to be heard. "You call this about protecting life," she said. "But if it were really about life, you'd care what happens after the delivery room." Someone in the gallery gasped softly. "You'd care that the United States has the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world. You'd care that black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy complications. You'd care that your own state has counties with no OB/GYNs at all," Jasmine continued, voice steady. "But you don't. Because caring doesn't poll well in your donor circles." Vance clenched his jaw. She saw it, the tiny spasm of irritation he usually hid behind his smile. But here, under the lights, there was nowhere to hide. "And let's talk about donors," Jasmine added, sliding another document across the table. "Since you want to discuss integrity. This is a record of campaign contributions you took from PACs that lobbied to cut funding to women's health programs. The same programs you now call a drain on taxpayers." She waited, letting him read the highlighted lines. He didn't pick up the paper. "That's not pro-life, Senator," Jasmine said. "That's transactional politics." The chairwoman looked like she might step in, but Jasmine lifted her hand slightly. Not to stop anyone, but to steady herself. "I'm tired," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I'm tired of watching men in this chamber twist faith into a weapon. I'm tired of watching them pretend that compassion is a weakness. And I am so tired of listening to people who have never once sat with a woman making the hardest decision of her life act like it's an easy choice." The room was still. "So go ahead," Jasmine finished. "Call me radical. Call me emotional. But don't you dare call me uninformed. Because unlike you, I didn't come here to score points. I came here to tell the truth." And for the first time, JD Vance looked like he finally understood he had underestimated her. Jasmine didn't sit down. She let the moment stretch, her presence expanding to fill every inch of the hearing room. "You know," she said finally, her voice gentler but somehow more unshakable, "when I was a young public defender, I spent months working with a woman named Erica. She had 3 kids, no health insurance, and a pregnancy that nearly killed her." She glanced over at JD Vance. He was staring at his hands now. "She was 28 years old," Jasmine continued. "And when she asked her doctor for help, he said he had to call the hospital's legal department first. She told me later that was the first time she realized the state had more say over her life than she did." Jasmine's fingers traced the edge of her binder. "That was over a decade ago. But here I am, in this chamber, listening to you pretend that same nightmare isn't happening right now to women all across this country." Her eyes swept the room, past the senators, past the staffers, straight to the cameras broadcasting every word. "I'm not here because I enjoy this," she said. "I'm here because someone has to look you in the eye and tell you that your policies don't protect life. They endanger it. A flicker of movement, someone in the press row wiping tears with the back of their hand. You can try to spin this, Jasmine said. You can call it moral conviction. But the record is clear. Your conviction ends where your donor's patience begins. JD Vance finally looked up. His mouth parted like he was about to protest, but no words came out. And I'm going to keep saying it, Jasmine pressed on. Because women deserve to hear that someone in this building gives a damn about what happens after the cameras turn off. She drew in a breath, voice steady as she delivered the final line. You say you want to be on the right side of history, she said. Then you'd better start acting like it. The chamber stayed frozen, every reporter scribbling notes, every aide leaning forward. For a moment, no one remembered the polls or the talking points. They only remembered the truth she'd just carved into the record, where it could never be erased. The chairwoman cleared her throat, her voice thin when she finally spoke. Thank you, Representative Crockett. Senator Vance, would you like to respond? JD Vance didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the rows of reporters, to the cameras whose red lights were still blinking. In that silence, you could see the calculus: how many headlines would carry Jasmine's words, how many voters might see through the rehearsed outrage he'd come here with. He adjusted his microphone, trying to regain the rhythm. With all due respect, he began, the phrase brittle on his tongue, I don't believe this discussion should be about personal attacks. It's not a personal attack to name the consequences of your policies, Jasmine interrupted, her tone like a scalpel, precise, undeniable. You talk about the sanctity of life, she continued. But when the lives in question are low-income women, or women of color, or women without insurance, you're silent. You have been silent for years. JD pressed his lips together, but she could see the flush rising on his neck. She didn't soften. You've built your career on moral purity, she said. But the truth is, your record is full of contradictions. You say you care about protecting children, but you vote against programs that feed them. You say you value families, but you vote against paid leave and childcare. Her voice grew quieter. Somehow, that only made it feel heavier. You want to lecture me about the sanctity of life, she said, while ignoring the sanctity of survival. A rustle in the press row as the reporters began scribbling faster. Let's be honest, Jasmine continued, you didn't come here to listen. You came here to score a headline. You came here to shame me because it's easier than admitting that your policies have failed the very people you claim to protect. JD Vance shifted in his chair, his hands folding tighter. Jasmine lifted her chin. But I'm not here to make you comfortable, she said. I'm here to make sure the people you've ignored have a voice in this building. The chamber was silent again, and this time, even Vance didn't try to fill it. Jasmine finally sat back, her binder closed in front of her like a quiet declaration that she'd said what needed saying. But even seated, her presence held the room in place. Across from her, JD Vance rubbed the bridge of his nose. His practiced composure was cracked, and everyone watching could see it. He knew this would be replayed tonight, on the news, in social feeds, in living rooms across America. The chairwoman glanced down the line, her voice almost hesitant. Senator Vance, any further remarks? He cleared his throat. I believe we have policy disagreements, but... Jasmine looked up, and the way she met his eyes made it clear he wasn't going to be allowed to pivot. Not this time. You're right, she said evenly. We do have disagreements. But only one of us is willing to be honest about what those disagreements cost. She rested her hands on the table. I have watched too many hearings where you pretend this is just a debate, she said. It's not a debate for the women whose lives are on the line. It's not a debate for the nurses who are terrified to treat miscarriages because of your laws. It's not a debate for the children who grow up hungry in your own state because you call every safety net a handout. Her voice was low, the words coming out steady, unhurried, and impossible to dismiss. You can call that an attack, she said. I call it accountability. JD Vance opened his mouth, but he didn't speak. Whatever he was about to say wouldn't have survived the weight of what she'd just laid down. The chairwoman gave a small nod, equal parts deference and relief. Representative Crockett, thank you for your testimony. Jasmine closed her binder, exhaled, and rose. She didn't look for applause. She didn't need it. The silence was enough. Reporters already had their lead. Staffers already had their orders. And the voters who'd tuned in expecting another sterile argument had instead witnessed something rarer. A moment when the script broke, and the truth stepped in. Jasmine left the chamber without another word. But everyone watching knew she'd already said everything that mattered. Before I leave this room, let me say this as clearly as I can, because too often, these hearings end with the same hollow pleasantries and nothing changes. I didn't come here to trade sound bites. I didn't come here to pretend that people's lives are some abstract policy experiment. I came here because the stakes are real. Because when we sit behind these microphones, we are deciding whether a woman gets the care she needs, whether a child gets to eat, whether a family gets to stay in their home. And if telling the truth about that makes some of you uncomfortable, good. It should be uncomfortable. Because that discomfort is the first sign that maybe, just maybe, we are finally acknowledging what so many people in this country already know, that dignity shouldn't depend on your zip code, or your income, or whether you can afford a lobbyist to fight your battles for you. I won't apologize for holding up a mirror. I won't apologize for expecting better from every person in this chamber. And I promise you this, I will keep showing up. I will keep telling these stories. I will keep demanding that we do better, because the people who sent me here deserve nothing less.